The Middle East and North Africa facing a long road to post-coronavirus economic recovery. According to figures from the International Monetary Fund, economies of the region are projected to contract by 5.7% this year, 2.4% more than initial projections from April.
The region has been facing a crisis like no other, a twin shock that affected both the normal functioning of their economy due to the confinement measures that were introduced and that helped save lives.
Countries with economies that are heavily dependent on oil, such as the states of the Gulf Cooperation Council, are projected to shrink even further by 7.1%. As countries locked down during the first wave of the pandemic, demand for oil ground to a halt, sending prices plummeting. They have since stabilized at around $40 a barrel, but well below pre-pandemic levels.
Oil exporting countries, we expect that they will lose around $270 billion of revenues from oil compared to last year, which is a big drop. This crisis will have an impact on their fiscal account as well as also on their external account.
And for countries plagued by conflict, the outlook is even more dire, with a projected retraction of 13%. Lebanon, whose economy is projected to shrink 12%, was already mired in a deep economic crisis prior to the pandemic. This week, Lebanese currency hit new lows, and some economists say the country is now the first in the Middle East to enter a state of hyperinflation, seeing its inflation rate exceed 50% for 30 consecutive days, making most goods unaffordable.
Lebanon is in a very worrying situation. The economic and financial crisis is raging. There are concrete, dramatic consequences for the Lebanese people who are getting poorer each day.
Honestly, in 1975, we had a 15-year-old war, and we didn't even witness what we are seeing today. Yes, there was a war, but you could find everything. The economical situation wasn't like it is now. Every region had its money and its influence. Now the economical situation is miserable, and it has affected us heavily.
In a region already plagued by instability, the long-term effects of the pandemic might stick around longer than the virus itself.
Now, for more on the issue, I'm joined by Paul Rivlin, economist and senior research fellow at the Moshe Dayan Center for Middle Eastern and African Studies. Paul, thank you so much for joining us. Now, I just want to zone in on this topic a little more and bring Israel into the picture and how it compares to other countries in the region. Now, Israel, we know, doesn't have any formal diplomatic or trade ties with most of the countries in the region, and the ones that it does are a little obscure. So let's take Lebanon, for example, and what's going on there with that unprecedented economic crisis that we just heard about in the report. Will their crisis pour over into Israel in any way, perhaps even militarily? And might we see an escalation?
That depends on the Hezbollah. There's nobody in Lebanon who has any interest in a conflict with Israel before, during, and after COVID. But Hezbollah has certain interests in conflict, and its leadership will decide whether it's in its interest to fight Israel or not. I think there was a few days ago a feeling that perhaps their interest was, and now the feeling here is that things are getting worse every day, and if they engage Israel, they would suffer politically in Lebanon. So the crisis in Lebanon, which has pre-COVID origins, made worse by COVID, like the difficulties in most countries of the world, will impact Israel only if Hezbollah decides to act, or if it's, if you like, forced by Iran to act.
Now, let's move on to the Gulf states here, because we know that their relationships with Israel is slowly warming with some of those. Now, we know there's also been business-to-business relationships developing, such as the COVID research between Israel and the UAE. Where could this potentially be going as Gulf countries try and diversify their economies away from oil at the moment?
Well, there are a lot of areas of mutual interest and possible cooperation, and these preceded COVID. One of them is the whole question, as you mentioned, of alternative energy sources, where we have some advantages, and another is water. More generally, the whole idea of a green environment. In the UAE, they've created a green city, which attempts to really rethink the way cities are built and operated. Israel has something to contribute in all these fields. It's not on a scale that will transform our economy or replace other markets, and it's not on a scale that will transform their economy. But it makes sense.
Now, let's talk about Jordan and Egypt specifically, because Israel does have peace treaties with those two countries, and we do have some known deals, like you just mentioned, deals with water, and there's a gas deal as well. Are we likely to see any other deals made between Israel and these two countries further down the track?
There's a lot of talk about cooperation with Jordan in electricity generation, in water. There are a lot of political barriers inside Jordan, a lot of bureaucratic problems on both sides. And perhaps the feeling there that they don't want to be dependent on us excessively, even if it relieves them of certain other dependencies that are very problematic. There's room for joint cooperation of projects. There's a lot of potential, but I also want to point out that Jordan is or should be a source of great anxiety to the Israeli leadership. There are 10 million people in Jordan now. The population there, despite everything, is growing very rapidly. Jordan is surrounded by countries that pose big political challenges. And I'll be quite explicit. Both Iraq with its different groups and its instability, both Syria with a civil war going on, and if that's not enough, then you have Israel, which is considering what's the word in English? Taking over parts of the West Bank and making them into sovereign Israeli territory, which poses very severe political threats. So the country is challenged demographically and economically, and is surrounded by political instability. And its stability and its well-being are of primary concern to us.